Welcome back to the channel. This is Abba with CoffeeNCode. Today we'll be having a look at a class overview. So we'll start by making a class called user, and then we will build all of the components and show you the steps to make the program better for maintainability reasons and for structure. And at the same time we'll be going through things like private, public, constructors, static classes, abstract classes and interfaces all in one video. So let's get started. So let's say our user would require a private string name and a private int age, and then we could use a constructor just to load these values in, and then we could say this.name equals name, this.age equals age. Okay, now we have a basic class set up. We can call this class by making a variable called user and given a new instance of the user class. And then inside the parentheses we could just put our name and our age. And then if we want to print it out, then we could say user dot, but as of right now we actually don't have anything available, so let's return some values in here. So we could have a function called public string return name, and then we can return name and maybe a public int for return age, and that can return the age. And now in here we have access to them, so we could say just return name, and then when we run the code we should just see ABBA come up. And if you wanted to, you could add a hyphen just to include them both, and return age as well. So now that we have a basic outline for a class, let's see the ways that we can make this better. So we could use properties. In order to use a property, we will make a public string name with a capital N, and then we can have a get which will return the name, and a set which will give us the name equals to the value. When this name gets called, if it's a call to get, it will return back the name value, and if it's a call to set, then whatever we set it with will be assigned into name. So now let's update our code using this. So this.name now becomes name equals, and because it's a name equals, that means it's a set, so this name gets passed into value, and therefore this name variable gets the value of value. And let's do the same thing with the age. Get the age and set the age to age equals value, and then we can also update this one and remove the this dot and capitalize the a. And then also when we go to return the functions, we could add the capitals to use the properties instead. Perfect. Another way of doing this is by using the auto properties, as it just says in this tip. So if we try and accept them, it will remove the private string, it will remove the new property we've just created, and because this pattern is exactly the same, what C# has done over the versions is made it simpler to be able to fit this pattern. So all you'd require to do now is do get and set, and get is equal to get and then arrow name. So you can replace this whole line with just the word get, because it knows what it's pointing towards, so you don't have to re-reference it, so you could just use the word get. And the same thing goes with the word set. You know what you're going to be setting, so there's no point in referencing it twice. And we could do the same thing with the age as well. So now we have our name and our age very simply like this. Just a quick recap here. So we have a public name and a public int. They both have get and set properties. We have a public constructor that loads in a name and an age and initializes them instantly. And then we have two public functions that simply just return the details of them, and maybe as well we could return details, and we could just return the name plus a hyphen plus the age, and we could just replace this with return details just to make the code a little bit easier. There we go. Now that we've defined what a user looks like, why don't we have a look and see what's going to happen if you want to make a manager class. So let's make a class called manager, and our manager is going to have exactly the same properties, so let's copy everything inside. Now the difference with the manager is maybe we want something like a title. So if we follow the same pattern, then we can add a title, and then we can add the title inside here. Cool. So now we added a new property. Oh, we just need to rename the constructor. So we just added a new property called title, appended the parameters for the constructor, and assigned the value into the new property we just created. And now we can have return title, and then we can return the title. We could add title to the list of details. So now if we want to create a manager, it's exactly the same patterns. New manager, ABBA 23, and then let's put CEO. And then we could do another console write, manager, and then we could return the details. Okay, perfect. You have two classes, one called user and one called manager, but they all contain pretty much the same details, except for our title property. So now when we notice these things that we're having to copy and paste into a project, then we should always look for ways to optimize this. So you can see that we have all of the similar functions here and here, so maybe we can do something about this. So we could create something called an interface. If you haven't seen an interface before, please click on the banner above and come back to this video. So we can create an interface called iUser, and in interfaces you can only really declare functions. So we have name age details and name age details, with the exception of return title, but that's specific to the manager. So we can include name age details and name age details inside of our interface. So we can just put string return name and an int return age and string return details. Perfect. Now in order to use this interface, then we would put a colon after the user and type in iUser. So now that means that this class inherits from this interface, and if we didn't include this function, for example, then we would get an underline in this function saying that it does not implement the interface member return name. So interfaces are a way that we can define functionality without actually writing the code. Perfect. Now we also covered abstract classes, abstract user. Okay, so before we continue, we can inherit from our user, so we know which functions to use, and we can get rid of this for the time being. Okay, so it says here, you haven't implemented any of them functions, so we can start by typing string return name, but we also need to give it whether it's public or private, so in this case we want to make it public. Now we don't actually have anything to return as of right now, because the properties are down here. So let's actually start defining the properties inside the abstract class as well. So we can make our public string name, make it a get and a set, and then inside here we can just return the name. Now that we've created the name, we also need to return the age and return the details as well. So in order to return the name, then we also need to create an age property, just like above. Then we can make our return function, return age, and then we can return the age. Now we're nearly there, we just need to do return details. So now we can do a public string, return details, and then we can do return name plus a hyphen plus the age. Perfect. So now that meets the criteria perfectly. So now that we've included the name, the age, the two functions, plus the return details, we can actually start to remove them out of here and see what happens. Let's start with the user class first. So first we can just inherit from abstract user, and we can get rid of name and age, and we can get rid of all of these functions. So now that we've removed everything inside the user class that can be included inside the abstract user, which is the properties and their functions, and the functions are included in the interface, so you can see how the chain is going. So we have a class called user, which inherits from abstract user, which means inside the user class we have access to a public name, a public int, and the three functions, and this will only run and not get a syntax error because we have inherited from our user, and our user defines that we have to have these things. If we change the name, for example, then we're going to get an error saying that it doesn't implement it, so we have to keep it. If we would like to change the name, then we have to change it on both, and then we won't get the error. Interfaces are just used to make sure that you've defined the functionality that you think you need, and then when you go to use it, then it actually makes sure that you are in fact using it, just in case you might have wrote some functions down that you might plan to use, but then you actually forget when you come to implement them. The interface will stop you from compiling if you have inherited from it and you don't include the functions. So, what we can do now with the constructor, we have two options really. We can include the constructor inside the abstract user as follows. So we can specify the constructor using the public, then the name of the class, which is abstract user, and then we can specify just like we have here, because we're using our two properties. So we can just do string name, int age, and then we can open the brackets, and inside we can use our properties just like we have here. So name equals name, and then age equals age. Perfect, now we have an error. So it says there's no argument given that corresponds to formal parameter name. So the problem here is that we have a constructor inside here, and because we're inheriting from it, we should really use it. So let's remove our contents, and then in order to make use of this constructor inside of this constructor, we can use something called the base. So we can have a colon here, and we can type base. And because these variables are being passed into this function, the constructor, we can also pass them into the base. So we can just put name and age. So what that's doing is when you call new user, it'll put ABBA into string name, 23 into age, and then it will pass these back into the base right here, and the age right here, and the base in this case is the abstract user, and this is the constructor. So it'll go from here to here, then pass the values inside here, and the base is in here, and it will call this constructor, and then it will assign the values. So now if we run this program again, we should actually see no change. Perfect. So now let's modify the manager exactly like we just did for the user. So let's inherit from abstract user, and then let's get rid of everything that we don't need. So we can get rid of return name, return age, and here is the tricky one. So we have return details, which is specified right here. But now the problem is, our details only takes in the name and the age, but doesn't involve the title, because our abstract user only contains a name and an age. So in order to include a title, what we can do instead is remove this function from here and make it an abstract inside here, which means all of its child classes will need to implement that function. So what we can do is remove this and put a semicolon, and then just after here we can put abstract. What that means is if any class inherits return details, they will need to give their own definition for this function. So in here we can write public, and then we'll need to use the override keyword because we're telling it that we'll be overriding what will be present for this function. And then we can just copy the rest, which will be string return details, remove the semicolon and add the curly braces, and then in the case of just a user, we would only want to return the name and the age, so we can do return name plus a hyphen plus the age. Perfect, so now we have another error, but let's just continue with our refactoring. So we could remove name and age because that's present in the abstract user, and we could remove the setting of the properties in here, and then we will require to call the base class constructor again. So that's a colon followed by the base, and as it tells us here, we only need the name and the age, so we have them available here so we can pass them in. That's fine. So now we have our additional title because we have our title that's specific only to the manager. So we'll need our return function because title is only specific to the manager, so we would need our own one, and this is not included inside the abstract user. So in order to override the return details, all we have to do in this case is just write the word override, and just before I do that you can see that this has an underline and it says that it's not implemented the return details. So once we override this, and now we can return name, age and title from the manager, but then just return name and age from the user. So let's just have a really quick recap. So if we run the program, we can see still nothing has changed since the start, because we want this to happen, because what we're doing is we're keeping the data the same, but just updating the maintainability of the program. So we have an interface called iUser. We're defining 3 functions: return name, return age, and return details. We then have an abstract user that inherits from the iUser interface, and then this will define their name, their age, the return functions, a return function for the details just as an abstract so the children can implement their own code, and then we have a constructor that just initializes our properties based on the parameters that are passed to the constructor. And then we have a user class that inherits from the abstract user. We don't have anything in the constructor because we don't have anything specific for the user class. Everything is embedded within the abstract user. When we pass in the parameters for the constructor for the user class, we'll pass them straight to the base class constructor, which will just give us the abstract user, and we had to override the return details that was specified in the abstract class right here. That's why we have that word in, and then we can specify that we're going to return the name and the age. And finally, the class manager is also inherits from the abstract, but with the manager we have an extra title property, so we have that specified here. In the constructor of the manager we have both the name and the age, which are needed for the base class, and then we have an extra parameter which is required for the title to set our new property. And then we just have a return title function that just returns this value, and then we're again overriding the return details just so we can add our own title. If we didn't override the details, then we would only be stuck with name and age, and we wouldn't be able to return the title as well. And the main hasn't changed, we're just creating a user, and then printing the details, creating a manager, and then printing the details. So now that we've covered all of the classes, the abstract classes, the interfaces, let's just briefly go through a static class. So if we have a static class called calculator, and then we had something inside it, now the problem here is if you make a static class, then everything inside it will also need to be static, and then it will work, so then you'll be able to access it as follows. Then you can type something. If we remove the static class reference, then this will still work because this function inside is still a static. If we remove this and just make it a normal class, then you'll see we'll get an error. The key thing to note here is you can make a function static and still include other functions inside here, and it won't affect the static function, and you just won't be able to see this because it won't be static. So if we just confirm that, you can see that you can't see something else. If you want to create a class and only have one item as static, then you can do that. If you want to create a class with everything being static, then you can type static class, and then only things that are static can be accessible in here, and it won't let you compile if they're not. Thank you for watching. This is my classes overview. We covered quite a lot in this video, so if you have any comments, please drop them below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Don't forget to check out my Patreon if you want to support the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.